Welcome to another episode of CEX Talks, where we explore the evolving landscape of customer experience and contact center innovation. I'm your host, Abhi Jain, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Kali Sarim, Vice President of Customer Experience at Symtrain. Welcome, Kali.
Thank you. Excited to
Okay.
be here.
Kali brings unique perspectives from her journey in business marketing to pioneering AI powered training solutions for contact centers. In our recent episode, Her Impact, Her Voice, we explored the critical role of women in leadership within the customer experience industry. Today, we'll build on those themes while examining how learning and development is being transformed through AI data driven strategies that elevate customer experience and the unique leadership approaches pioneering the future of contact centers. So, Callie, before we dive into these exciting topics, I'd love to hear about your journey. What does a vice president of customer experience, do at Simtrain, and how did you get here?
For sure. Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest things growing up was I knew I always wanted to lead a team or run a company or be in sales, kind of the general scope of business growing up. And so one thing for me, I have a bunch of family in the industry, whether it's current or growing up. So I knew growing up I didn't want to be in call centers, but yet here I am. So kind of my journey and my path is I started at a BPO as a BDR. So I was doing outbound sales, cold calls, emails, all of those different components. And I think, as a BDR, whether it's BPO, tech, whatever it might be, that's a really good platform for people who want to grow into different ways or might not even know what they want to do yet, right? I've seen a lot of people go from BDRs to support, whether it's customer support or more tech support, go into more of the traditional role of an account executive, customer success, all kind of those different areas. So for me, obviously, as you know, being at a BPO, we had a lot of tech partners. And so that kind of switched me over to the tech side where I did enterprise sales and more of the strategic accounts for kind of the top 75 accounts. And then led me to Symtrain about 2.5 years ago doing the same thing. And so since being at Symtrain, I've been promoted now twice. The first time was just kind of overseeing the entire sales team. And then now really the entire customer experience. So really everything kind of revenue generating, everything now from biz dev to sales to implementation, customer success, partners, kind of all of those different customer facing programs.
And you have seen contact centers inside out, so it makes for an interesting sales experience, I guess,
For sure. I
and being
think
able to connect, to what the real needs are, and then trying to solve for them.
absolutely. And I think that's kind of the unique approach is being on the BPO side is you see it from a call center, but then you also see it from the brand perspective too. So you get both aspects of it. And then now with technology, just obviously rapidly emerging too, that helps kind of shape that perspective and understanding the different sides of it.
No, it's a fascinating journey you've had so far, and it connects perfectly. In a recent episode which we did last week, we talked about how there are disparities in representation and unique perspectives women bring into the customer experience leadership. So just carrying on the same theme, my first question to you would be, how empathy, resilience, and cultural intelligence, are reshaping customer interactions that influenced, your leadership approach in this whole technology space.
Yeah, I think for me, when you kind of talk about those different qualities, it's definitely something as a leader you're constantly interacting with, right? And I think as a leader, it's really important to understand that it comes down to each person's a little bit different, right? They're all different in how they learn. They're different in what motivates them and drives them. So I think when we talk about, empathy, resilience, and overall cultural intelligence, you need to be able to adapt with each one of those. And so I would say, kind of from my viewpoint, resilience is probably the biggest one that at least directly relates to myself. And so when I think of resilience, I think there's a couple different aspects and different things you can do with it. Where, from my perspective, is there's resilience in constantly wanting to get better and be better, right? And so that can come from just learning about new topics or new tech in the space, but then also sharing that back with your team, right? I think as a leader, that's one big thing where if you're constantly improving and wanting to get better, so does your team. And so how do you kind of enable that internally as well, but then relying on your team for additional feedback? And being in more of that startup space is feedback is awesome, whether it's positive, it's negative, whatever it is, feedback helps you grow. And so I think that's something where it's not just the customer feedback, but it's internal feedback as well to just constantly improve there. So I would say that's kind of the biggest component of it in terms of kind of those three different.
While doing that, did you encounter any specific challenges or opportunities as a women leader in this industry that have shaped your approach? Especially given, I know you're very active with CCW Women, and the entire network. So,
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, it's not just being kind of like a woman in leadership. It's also for me, being young in the industry too is a challenge in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's one of the biggest kind of things that, specific encounter on challenges that I see is because I am young and I am a female and I'm in leadership, I'm kind of, looked at a little bit differently, which I've accepted, right? Like that was something being a part of a bunch of different kind of mentor groups and things like that is I knew that going into it, right? Like I knew I was going to kind of have those different comments or more of like the question mark from some people. And so I think for me, the biggest thing that I learned early on in my career was that I almost needed to work like 2 to 3 times more hard to be able to kind of prove them wrong in a sense, right? Where it's you can get those looks and kind of assumptions in that sense. But once you start actioning and kind of proving it out, that's really what matters, right? I think that's a big thing that people always say like, oh yeah, everyone's like talking about so and so or whatever the drama side and politics are. It's like that's fine, whatever. You can't control that, but it's you can only control what you can control, right? So I think that's something that really kind of motivates me is kind of proving some of those assumptions wrong.
and then I can vouch for that. I definitely that, you bring a perspective and the depth about the industry, which I've not seen from many people, who have spent like 20, 30 years in the industry. We have seen a lot more women, today leading innovative CX initiatives across the industry. Have you observed the landscape changing, and what still needs to happen, to advance diversity in leadership?
For
Because
sure.
in the last episode we talked about it, that while the representation is great, till the middle management layer, in the senior management layer, how do you advance that?
There's a couple different things. I think right now there's a huge sense of women empowerment in general, which is great to see. And so you mentioned CCW Women a couple minutes ago, right? Like
Correct.
that's a group that I'm a part of, and I think the biggest thing that kind of differentiates them versus others is the women empowerment for all different levels. So when you kind of talk about that, those specific challenges from a leadership perspective, that was something I found starting off in my career that there were a lot of women groups but they were all catered to women that were already in leadership.
Mhm.
And so that was the biggest challenge for me was wanting to be in that leadership role, but not necessarily having those groups and resources to help me get there. Where I think that's the biggest shift that we're seeing with women empowerment is now they're empowering people from all different levels, right? From an entry level that want to work their way up. How do you empower them? So I think that's the biggest kind of change that I've seen is it's not just empowerment at the higher ups where it's like, hey, how are you guys as a C level empowering your teams? It's going directly to those teams and saying, hey, how can we empower you? Whether that's introducing you to someone else or, giving you resources to help improve internally, whatever that might be. So I think that's kind of the biggest impact on it. And I think when we talk about it from innovation perspective, with that, you're just going to continue to see women grow into more of those leadership positions. And then obviously from like a tech perspective too, there's so much tech out there right now, and there's so much tech that still is yet to be built that I think that's where you're really going to see a lot more women founders in tech.
No, and then I'm looking forward to it. And are you seeing specific initiatives being done in that specific space, in the technology, in the innovation space, where, it's about, cultivating the talent more, especially from a women perspective, to bring them into, and then actually, funding, like those startups, or, making them successful. Are you seeing specific efforts happening in that space?
I think it ties directly into the empowerment side of it, right? Is like whether it's more of like the VC side of it, we're investing into these startup technologies, or a lot of people who are in college coming out of Stanford and Harvard and all of these colleges and saying, hey, like in my classes or as part of my network in college, we're building these different technologies and startups and being able to go out to the market a lot quicker. And obviously, I think social media has a really big play in that too. Obviously, it's a lot easier to kind of expand your reach and market in that way a lot faster as well. So I think that's kind of that key component, is that empowerment of kind of seeing, whether it's young female or early on in their career, is seeing other people higher up or later stage in their career and kind of having that self confidence and empowerment there.
Okay. And so, what advice would you offer to women aspiring to leadership roles in customer experience technology, particularly in the AI and training solutions, because that's where the entire future sits?
For sure. Yeah, I think for me, one that was given to me very early on was being a sponge. And so that was something like what I probably even before I started my career, but could have been day one, which really is like absorbing all the information and being able to action off of it, and kind of tying into like the social media side, whether it's social media, we're all on calls, we're on emails, we're in meetings. Like there is so much information out there now at everyone's fingertips. And so it's being able to really take that information and action off of it, right? And I think kind of tying to that is not being afraid to ask questions, right? For in order for you to really process and absorb the different information that you're seeing and hearing, you're not going to understand all of it, right? And that's totally fine. And I think that was something for me again, and especially as a female, it's maybe the concern of asking a dumb question, right? And so that was something that I used to do early on when I was like, oh, I don't want to say this in front of a boardroom of 15 people, right? So after a meeting, I would go to one or two people and say, hey, I have a couple questions of this. I never let that stop me from asking the questions. It might have been in a different group or to a different person, but I would always jot those questions down. And so I think that's the biggest kind of gap that I see right now, is not being able to ask questions or not feeling confident enough to do that. And so that's really the only way, I think, as a female or just in general, right, you're going to be able to learn and really grow quickly in your career and in the space.
So, be curious, ask questions, learn, and adapt.
Yep,
I was to sum it up.
for
Okay.
sure. Yep.
No, that's great. So, moving on, to your current role, right? So your experience with Symtrain puts you at the intersection of startup innovation and also established contact center operations, right? You're right in the middle of it. And that our global contact center market is projected to reach what, about $500 billion by 2027, and that number
Crazy.
keeps on changing. Whoever you talk to, it's a different
Exactly.
number,
Yep.
and it's creating a lot of opportunities for startups to introduce innovative solutions, right? So, what are you seeing, in terms of the next level of innovation? Where do you think is that sweet spot from your perspective, uh, which is yet to be, broken up?
Yeah. I think when you look at it from a growth perspective, that's something obviously we see advancements every single day, right? There's new innovations constantly coming out. And I think if you were to ask me that or ask anyone that 2 years ago, their answer would be completely different than what it is today. I think when you look at like open source models is a really good example. Like that changed the game for everyone. And so I think that's a really hard question to be able to really understand, because there's also so much money going into this, right? Like there's all eyes on it right now. And there's multiple different channels of it, right? You have a lot of people who are heavily invested in AI, and you have other people that are just starting to get their feet wet with it and really just trying to understand the basics of it. And I think that's what's so exciting about it too, is that everyone is in a little bit of a different place. So I think, there's a high demand for it, and there's a lot of pressures from both the brands, but then also the tech side to not only deploy but build a lot of these too. And so I think it'll be interesting to learn and kind of see how these brands are deploying and see what's most effective, right? And really kind of being able to tie that to ROI. And I think looking at it from a smart growth perspective. So making sure that the adoption and the innovative solutions that are being developed or being adopted actually makes sense, right? Like there's a lot of tech out there that's just out there, right? It doesn't necessarily solve for a pain. And so whether you're again building that tech or you're on more of the brand side and you're adopting it, making sure that it's actually going to solve for a pain that you have or make a huge impact on your overall ROI for it.
Which actually, raises an interesting point, because if you look at it, still, 79% of the callers get rerouted on the first call. So would love to understand, how Symtrain is addressing some of these things, through your AI solution, because the problems have still remained the same. If you look last 10 years, the top three issues, which are on top of the mind, for any contact center operator is all around the agent. It's all on the employee. It's all about their associates. How do you make them learn faster? How do you make them love what they're doing, and then provide a better CX? So would love to get your perspective on how are you guys solving.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it kind of ties to the process of the brand, right? So for Symtrain specifically, it's really about enabling the agents to be more confident and more proficient with the different scenarios that they're going to encounter, right? So when we talk about it from kind of like a rerouting perspective, a common simulation that we see is really just getting like hands-on practice on a CRM, right? Or it could be how to navigate their knowledge base. So when we talk about rerouting, from my viewpoint at the core, there's really kind of two reasons that it would happen. And so one would be because internal process is broken, right? Like there's a need for them to route and that agent has no idea what to do, and all they know is that they need to give it to someone else. But then that's also that second issue is the agent doesn't know, right? They're not proficient enough in that scenario to be able to handle that. So those are kind of the two pieces. And so Symtrain really comes in on enabling those agents to be able to handle those different scenarios, whether it's the first touch point or it's the second, right? Really understanding like, hey, what is the pain for this? And I think that's another really common solution of a simulation that we see for this specific type of scenario is being able to at least ask the right questions to understand what the pain or what the solution is. I know that's something as a customer on my side, if I call in and I get routed to someone else and that person is the wrong person, that drives me nuts, right? Like they route me to a different department and it's not even the right person that I should be talking to. And there's nothing more frustrating as a customer than then having to go to another person and re-explain your issue. So that's another really common scenario we see is just making sure that they're also doing the right like discovery and probing questions to really understand, hey, what's going on, so they can make sure that they're routing those customers to the right department or line of business.
And then how does the Simtrain AI platform enables it versus a traditional training? Because won't in the traditional training we were targeting the same thing? So what's changed? What's changed? How is AI helping us here?
For sure. I think there's multiple different aspects of it from a Symtrain perspective, right? It's not just on training and getting agents more proficient. It's also the coaching of upskilling and cross-skilling, right? So really looking at it from a personalized approach, where when we talk about, again, rerouting, it's I could have a different reason for having to reroute versus you. Each agent's a little different and kind of their specific performance metrics. And so with Symtrain, we're really able to customize the different simulations to the agent's specific KPIs that they're struggling with. So we'll look at things like call recordings and QA scorecards and metadata and create these customized simulations, whether it's around rerouting or any other kind of scenario or KPI that they're struggling with, to help them improve on that. And really that key is being able to do it in this simulated environment. So they're not practicing on your customers, right? It's not the first time that they're going to go through it. They're going to do it in the simulated environment. So then when they do talk to the customers, they're fully proficient in those different scenarios. But I think it really just ties on down to utilizing the AI to make sure it is customized for each agent. Because if I'm someone learning about one topic and I'm fully proficient in that, but I'm not learning a specific topic that I'm actually struggling with, I'm never going to improve on that, right? I'm not getting that hands-on practice and repetition there.
So it's creating personalized learning journeys, as per your individual personas,
For
right?
sure. Yep. Based on
And
your
then,
specific data.
and
Yep.
then does Simtrain also take into account, one is how you learn, right? Second is also, your inherent personality traits. Like, someone might be a bit more introvert, but, they are in a job, So does it address, all of those simulations too?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it looks at it from an agent and a customer slash simulation perspective, right? So when you talk about the different personas, not only can you kind of look at it from a customer perspective, where you're going to get your happy customer, you're going to get your angry customer, that does happen. You're going to get maybe your sarcastic one, right? So you're also going to get the different personas from the customers as well. Because I think that's another gap when we look at training or coaching is oftentimes we always think of like the happy path or the golden call, which is great. And I hope that's a majority of everyone's calls, but it's not realistic, right? You're going to get the angry customers that come in. So, how do you enable the agents to be able to handle those different personas? And then also from an agent perspective, if I'm a little more introverted, I don't want to go into a training class with 20 other people in my first week and have to do a role play in front of the entire class. Like nobody wants to do that. Even if you're extroverted, you don't necessarily want to do that, right? So it's also providing this kind of like confidence and comfortability in the platform where it's okay for you to mess up, right? When we talk about it from a training perspective, Nobody expects you to know anything in your first week. And that's the whole point, right? We want you to mess up and fix and practice those mistakes so you can continue to get better.
And that's a very important point you raised, because today, you have multiple generations, in the same training class, who all have very different needs on how they want to be trained, how they learn. And it becomes very important to create those personalized journeys in their personal time, which they can complete. So which is great. And have you seen, how has that impacted, average handle times, or other efficiency metrics?
A lot of different KPIs, right? It really depends on kind of the line of business, but at the end of the day, what we've seen is just confidence in general of an agent from a training perspective. That first day that they hit the phone call with a live customer, they're going to be more proficient because they're more confident, right? So when we look at it from kind of different KPIs, there's a bunch of different ones: average handle time, overall proficiency, cutting down on training time is a really big one. NPS, CSAT, all of those kind of different scores of it. But again, really being able to kind of enable the agents to get that hands-on practice in there, to be able to kind of improve those different things.
As you're, working with a lot of different contact centers, both in-house and outsourced, I'm sure the big debate is how much of AI is too much. Have you seen, is there a right mix of learning things between AI and human touch, or it just depends on the individual brands, and the individual trainers?
I would say it depends, in my opinion. I don't think there is kind of this one specific 50-50 split that solves everyone's problems, right? I think it also depends on the different technologies you have, right? You could have 10 different AI solutions in your company and you could be 75% of that, but you're less efficient as a company because of that, right? So there's this balance of it. I think it depends on the technology. It depends on how many. You can have someone that has 15 different technologies. You can have someone that have 5, right? They're going to be at completely different levels, and it depends on what that technology is. So I don't think right now that there is this one specific metric that solves everyone's problem on balancing human and AI. I do think it really depends on each company. I will say I think we're starting to see more data industry on by industry on kind of what that looks like, for retail versus more of the airlines, for example. We're seeing some companies adopt different things and getting more visibility into it. But again, I don't think it is a one size fits all there.
And is there any particular industry where you have seen more adoption of AI based learning tools versus another industry?
I think it depends. I think when we talk about, from a training perspective, I think it's heavier adopted on heavily regulated industries like insurance, financial services, healthcare, just because their training time is so long a lot of times, right? There's so much compliance that goes into those industries that we're seeing, starting off 14-week training times. I'm sure you're seeing that with a lot
Yeah.
too, where you see other industries like retail or travel and hospitality that are usually like 4 to 6 weeks. So I think that kind of big pain point of, hey, it's taking so long just to get our agents to production because training time is so long, because it needs to be in kind of that traditional method, because there's so many topics to get to and there's not enough time to do it, right? So I would say that. I will say there's a flip side of that too on a lot of those industries like healthcare, insurance, and financial services. They're still working through the guidelines on what AI to adopt, right? And those are changing every week. So I think it also depends on the type of AI and kind of the specific company regulations as part of it too.
71% of the consumers expect personalized interaction. Okay. And then 76% get frustrated when this doesn't happen, which is mind-boggling statistic. So how does AI based training cater to that, on an agent delivering that personalized experience?
Yeah, so I think it depends when you look at it from like a Symtrain perspective. The data needs to be there. I think for me as a customer, right, I'm part of that percentage that does get frustrated sometimes. And again, there's not a one size fits all where for whatever reason I don't, when I'm like purchasing a pair of shoes, I don't want to talk to anyone. I don't have like a rhyme or reason. But if I'm getting shoes, I want it delivered. Like I don't want to talk to someone. But if I'm dealing with anything around like booking an appointment or financial services, healthcare, anything there, I do want to talk to someone. So I think it really kind of depends, and it's being able to get that data for the agents to be able to best handle those scenarios, right? If you don't have that data on, hey, how many of my customers want to use chat versus email versus phone versus completely self serve, the agents can't really help in that manner, right? That comes down to more of the process driven components. They can be fully enabled and fully proficient in those specific scenarios. But if you don't have a specific channel that your customers want, they're going to be frustrated either way. So I think a lot of that is more of the process driven and just general data and insights into your customer base and really understanding kind of those different components on, hey, I want to use this versus that. And we're continuing to see that now, whether it's customer or agent, the younger generation, everything needs to be quick. It needs to be easy. It needs to be however they want it, which is fine. But then you now have all these different options and paths and different processes internally. So there's all of these components that come with it where I don't think like a everyday consumer is going to recognize, hey, how much actually of the back end stuff needs to happen in the call centers.
And then, for any AI, data needs to be there, and the right data needs to be there, for it to work. Are you seeing that equation change? Because see, data, we have been talking about it for 5 decades, I think,
Yes.
uh, you know, even before we were there. But have you seen the maturity level of data going up, or companies focusing more and more?
For sure. I would say it's definitely increasing. So much so that I think it's now created a bigger gap is there is so much data out there that now companies don't know what to do with it, right? Like there is so much data within a call center from the first touch point of a customer all the way to the last. And you can say you have data, you have all these insights, it's great, but how do you action off of that? What do you do with that data? And so I think that's a really big gap. And kind of from a Symtrain perspective, that's something, whether it's training or coaching, really looking at it from a time perspective. That's now the biggest gap is now that I have all the different data components, they're usually in 10 different platforms. And I now have to manually go in and decipher all the information and then usually create a plan off of it. Right. And so when we look at it from even like a manager supervisor perspective, they have all the different QA scorecards now, call recordings, all of these different components to say, okay, I know 100% of my agents' interactions and where they're at. But I still now have to manually go in and do a coaching session with them. Or I need to bring something up in our one on one and do some role plays or do a group coaching session. There's still that big manual element of taking that data and being able to action off of it. And where SimTrain comes in is really, again, taking those call recordings and QA scorecards and being able to customize simulations for them to get that hands-on practice. But I do think data is everywhere now, which is great, but data is only good if you can do something with it.
And then, while doing this, what metrics or KPIs have you found most valuable when measuring effectiveness of an agent training program?
Yeah, I think this is maybe not a specific metric, but I think one of the biggest ones is time, right? When you look at it from an agent effectiveness perspective, it's agents, but then it's also the trainers and managers. So when you think of a training class first week, right? You hear oftentimes, they'll have a class of 20 agents and it's one trainer, right? For them to do a role play exercise with each one of those, it takes a long time for them to do. Also, you don't want to have them break out and do role plays with the other agents because everyone's in their first couple weeks, so they don't really know right from wrong either. So typically what we see is like a timepiece, right? Where if you look at it in more of the traditional method of having a trainer do a role play with an agent, typically takes about 10 to 15 minutes, right? That obviously includes more of like the coaching and feedback as part of it. But with SimTrain, now you were able to do that, 3 times the amount of repetitions of those simulations in the same or shorter amount of time. So I think from a time perspective, that's like the number one thing, whether it's training or coaching, is really just saving time for everyone. But we see different KPIs all over the place, right? As the time piece happens, it's also improving proficiency, average handle time. Retention is a really big one, right? So when we look at that, where agents are just more, we talked about it earlier, the confidence piece, because they're more confident, they're going to stay longer, right? They have all these tools and resources now that are helping enable them, which makes them want to stay, right? If they're good at their job, they don't necessarily want to leave. If someone's bad at their job, that's typically where you see a lot of people leave, right? So I think that's kind of the big components of it, where time again isn't a traditional KPI that's on a QA scorecard or anything like that, but I think that's one of the kind of the biggest pieces we see.
So talking about AI, right? We talked about, hey, each company has their own AI path. You are an AI based company. What are some of the ethical challenges or the more, I would say, regulatory challenges that you see evolving, which will impact some of the adoption of the AI technologies?
Yeah, I think it depends on the industry, right? I think for us, since we are a simulated environment, we don't deal with any PII, PCI, everything's redacted, right? Whether it's the scenarios and call types, or it's the system. So we're not necessarily touching any live data. So I think when you look at it from a compliance perspective, it's constantly evolving. We have a lot of customers in insurance and financial services where they need to be able to create simulations and edit them really quickly because everything constantly changes. I think it also ties into kind of our earlier topics and discussion is just around like the overall like adoption and awareness too is everyone's at different levels. Some people are fully invested and some are just starting to get their feet wet. And I think that has an impact on a lot of the different compliance components that go in to AI where it's still a learning curve, right? A new technology is going to come out tomorrow and do the same thing and just kind of wreck everyone's understanding of AI. Now you need to change your process and your compliance and regulations there. So it's a constant evolution. I think the biggest piece there is as a company or industry, whoever's kind of looking at the different components internally is really understanding the tech and having that knowledge of the impacts it make. But again, just really understanding at its core, like what is AI and kind of what are those different kind of impacts there to be able to make those specific regulations based on the data.
And how can companies drive the AI adoption at scale?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think the biggest thing that they would need to look at is when they are adopting technology is earlier we talked about pain, right? Having those technologies identified to a pain. A lot of times we see companies adopt tech just because, right? And so that doesn't help in 2 years down the line because they're like, oh, well, I checked this box and adopted an AI tool because someone told me to, right? But I just grabbed a random one and now I have other tools and they don't work together and it doesn't make sense and it just creates more issues. So I would say that's really kind of the biggest piece to grow from a skill perspective is you got to look at things like does it integrate with my other technologies I have out there? That's a big one. I'm continuing to see kind of that increase is rather than having 10 tools, can we have 5 that all speak to each other, right? So really looking at those types of things from a scale perspective. But again, just really making sure that the technology you're bringing on solves for something, right? You don't want to just check the box. You really want to make sure that there's a solution tied to it.
Got it. Got it. No, this is great. So let's look towards the future a bit, right? In the future of contact centers. And I would love to hear your perspectives on what are the emerging trends, how should leaders prepare for their next growth, or implementing AI. So what emerging technologies beyond the current AI landscape do you believe have the most significant impact, on contact centers, say in the next 2 years? I know 2 years is still also a long time given the
Yes.
AI,
I
but
know. I'm like, it's such a hard question because like there's this balance of like the build versus buy too, right? So it's like the adoption piece and just new technologies, that could be something where with kind of those open source models, everyone can go in and kind of build. But then it also enables everyone else to build so much quicker too, where you can buy technology. And I think when we talk about like the trends and kind of the different pieces out there, it's really hard to kind of determine that. Like, hey, what are the up and coming components? Because again, earlier, if you were to ask me that question 2 years ago, you wouldn't know necessarily. And so I think it's really utilizing the data side of things where it's again, there's so much data out there. I don't think the next emerging tech is out there yet, where it's like, hey, we still have so much data we need to figure out where it's like, hey, what is that next kind of groundbreaking solution, right? Is it looking at it from a recruitment perspective? Is it looking at it from a training perspective? Is it QA? Like, where are those specific components? I think we talk a lot about, like conversational intelligence, real-time agent assist, right? And I know we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but like that's something we've talked about together a couple times where it's everyone talks about real-time agent assist, and I like to use it as an example always because of this is because everyone has kind of their different opinion or definition on what it is, right? Like we've talked about that for 5+ years now, and still not everyone's on the same page on understanding, like, hey, what is this necessarily, right?
and that's a constant discussion, especially train or assist,
Correct.
right? And then to me, it's the same analogy I give people is even if you're in a driverless car, if the car breaks down, you need to know what to do with it. So
Correct. Yep. And I think that's the biggest piece too, is also looking at it where it's like, okay, now, you have your real-time agent assist component where it's kind of guiding you throughout. But it's also like, in my opinion and viewpoint of it, it's looking at it from like an IVA perspective, where it's like, hey, now you have the core steps and prompts for both the customer and agent side, where it's looking at those tier one, tier two components and saying, hey, talking more to the IVAs, right? I think 5 years ago, we started to see them take off a little bit. I'm shocked that IVAs haven't taken off more. To be completely honest, I just think there's so many surrounding technologies for that type of product that it'll slowly work its way up. I thought it was going to make a bigger impact.
okay. And then that's interesting. So let me tie that. So we talked about IVS, we talked about real-time agent assist. I know your journey. You've been with auto QA company, you've been with accent neutralization space, but there's still this whole debate. And you talked a minute about how you don't want to talk to anyone if you're buying a shoe. We've been hearing about it for a long time, that voice is going to go away. But voice has stayed constant, for the last at least 7 years of data, which I have seen.
Yep.
Do you see that? Do you see voice channel, going down? And then because of that impacts the training, right? Do I need to train on voice or do I need to train on chat? How are you seeing that, in your customer base or your industry discussions?
Yeah, I think from a use case perspective at Symtrain, voice is our number one use case that we support, right? Definitely not seeing a decrease in that from an agent and just overall training perspective. We are seeing folks add more channels like chat, email, more social media and back office agents, but voice is still here, right? Like everyone uses it. Again, for me, retail specifically, I don't want to talk to anyone, but a lot of other industries, I don't want to play around with the chat bot. I don't want to look at the knowledge base. Like, I want to talk to someone. So I don't have my personal methodology on why I want to talk to someone for one thing and why I don't for another thing. But I think talking to a lot of people, everyone's the same way, right? Like there's specific things you want to do where you need help, and there's specific things you want to do on your own. And so I think because it is a lot of the customer led conversations on voice, it'll be interesting with kind of this younger generation coming in to see that impact in 5-10 years down, maybe. I know a lot of people that don't want to talk on the phone at all, and that's the last
Yeah.
thing they would ever want to do, right? And I always laugh, especially from like an agent perspective. That's a lot of feedback sometimes for whatever reason, where it's like, oh, I didn't necessarily know I was going to be talking to someone. It's like, okay, yeah, totally fine. Yep. There are chat and email programs, but this is for a voice piece where you will need to be answering and taking phone calls. So we're definitely not seeing a decrease in it. I think it's still going to be a couple more years at least until that eventually happens.
And then for that future, what leadership skills do you think will be most critical to successfully navigate it?
I think the biggest thing is going to be like adaptability, to be honest. I think that's something where again you look at the different technologies, whether it's building or it's adopting, everyone's at a different place, right? So if you're not able to adapt on new tech that's out there or adapt within your company and just really have that understanding of the constant evolution, you're not necessarily going to be able to grow in your career or help grow your company either. So I think that's probably going to be the number one thing, is just being able to adapt, because again, you never know what's going to happen and what's going to come out there. There's so many competing products out as well, where it's being able to adapt, where you're looking at one product and something else happens with another one. How do you adapt and kind of migrate from different ones even within the same space?
Thank you. So, Kali, this has been an incredible, insightful conversation. So, before we wrap up, what's the one piece of advice you would give to our listeners who are really looking to transform their approach to agent development and hence the overall customer experience?
Yeah, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think the biggest thing was just don't adopt AI just because someone told you to, right? We hear so often that someone told them to go look at AI tools, they check the box off. We see it at conferences all the time, but it really impacts you in the long run. So, really, just making sure when you are adopting new technology or just starting to look at them is really understand those pain points of your company, your customers, also your agents, and being able to tie ROI to that. So then you have kind of that long term success and scalability.
And that's a very, very fair ask. Let's understand your own agent experience score and your customer effort score.
Yep,
And then match it to see, what makes sense, what
for
actually
sure.
makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So,
And that's one of my favorite things at conferences is when someone walks up and they're like, I'm looking at AI. I'm like, awesome. Why? What? Like, just like, what are the different components underlying to that? And they don't really know. They're like, my boss sent me to the conference. I'm like, love it. There's so many options
I
here
would say
for
the
you.
first question you should ask them is, are you looking at AI or machine learning or
Yep.
simple data analysis? Because that itself, will educate people, on what to look at. So
Very true. Yes. Yeah. No, that's actually a really good point. We'll have to try that at CCW.
yeah, no, we should. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, with our audience here. This was a valuable session.
Yeah. Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
For our listeners, you can learn more about Kali's work at Symtrain by visiting their website. And I'd encourage you to connect with her on LinkedIn for more insights on contact center innovation. You can also find this episode and all of our previous discussions on our YouTube channel at youtube.com at CEX Talks. Join us next week when we'll continue exploring the transformation of customer experience with another industry leader. Until then, this is Abhi Jain for CEX Talks. Join us next week.